Okay, I did it. I clicked on the wrong thing, and so this is going to be part two. But this was not a planned part two, so I may end up having to do a planned part three. We'll see. Again, my apologies. I'll still go through here. So the point is, Caesar proclaimed himself dictator. Now, um, that was seen as a problem. And one of the people, Cicero, I mentioned about religion, was a fierce defender of the Republic. And he also supposedly advocated for getting rid of Caesar. And there was a senator at the time named Brutus, and who was related to the Brutus who had been part of the assassination of Tarquin. And Cicero, for all his eloquence and rhetoric, being able to persuade the Senate of so many things as a lawyer speaking before the Senate, who served as consul himself for a period, said, Brutus, take up the role of your ancestor and rid us of this tyrant. Now that becomes immortalized in Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar, and the famous line "Et tu, Brute," you too, Brutus. Now we don't know how historical, if that was historical at all, but he was assassinated in the Senate on the Ides of March, which is March 15th, 44 BCE. And chaos really did begin. Then what? Then what happens? Um, After Caesar, there is fighting for who's going to come to rule. There's chaos. And Caesar's nephew, named Octavian, is able finally to come to the fore. But let me just show you here. This is a map, this next map on the slide, of the extent of Roman Republic at the death of Caesar in 44 BC. So you can see when I say empire and empire, if you look at that red or pink territories, that is already an empire, even though it's being ruled by a republic in terms of the form of government. But what comes about with Octavian is the establishment of the Roman Empire not being ruled by the Roman Republic, but being ruled by the Roman Emperor and the Roman Empire in terms of an imperial form of government. Just let that kind of sink in what that was going on at the time. Now, we go to the Augustan Revolution. Now, what's the Augustan Revolution? That is with Octavian, the son of a god. Octavian proclaimed himself the successor of his uncle Julius Caesar, and there's evidence that Julius Caesar had appointed him as his successor. He had to kind of fight for it to assert his claim, but he finally does. And then he does a number of things. There's son of a god. He first proclaims himself, or proclaims Julius Caesar as having been divine. Now, typical people can be divinized, can be made part of the pantheon, can become gods. That was very much a classical idea. And there was a lot of opposition to Caesar. So Octavian realized, oh my God, you know what? We have to change people's minds. If this is going to work, we have to change people's minds. That's what we refer to as the Augustan Revolution, because Octavian took the name of his uncle Caesar, whom he said also had adopted him as a son. So he took Caesar's name. And Caesar at first was just a name. It was just a family name. It became an office. Thereby, by proclaiming himself Julius Caesar's son, and then divinizing Julius Caesar, making Julius Caesar a god into the Roman pantheon, that meant that he, Octavian, was then a son of a god. That's a pretty big deal. After he establishes his authority, he then returns power to the Senate, as Sulla did, at least superficially. That was in 27 BCE, we talk about the beginnings of the Principate. The Latin word princeps simply means first. It's the root of our term prince, root of our term principle. And the Principate was the new form of government because Octavian said, I am returning power to the Senate. I'm renouncing power for myself. I will simply serve as the first citizen, the princeps, the first citizen. He ruled with um, charismatic authority and power. Now, Max Weber, who was a 19th century, late 19th century sociologist and brilliant, analyzed different types of power and authority, institutional power and authority, legal power and authority, and then charismatic authority and power. Charismatic authority, I think, it's some people have it, some people don't. You can't go out and get it. It's that the it that somebody has. Ooh, they have it, and that charisma. And Octavian had it. And the Senate was so pleased that here we go, okay, we're avoiding this dictator for life that Julius Caesar had proclaimed himself, and that Octavian is returning power to the Senate. That is such a wonderful thing. He is magnificent for doing that. He is literally august. August, our term, August, the month of August. But it's still an English term, august. It means magnificent, almost awesome. And it did. And so he became known as Augustus, the magnificent one, Augustus. And his name was Caesar. So he became known as Caesar Augustus. Even though he gave power back to the Senate, he ruled with charismatic authority. So he was in charge. Everyone knew he was. And then he did other things that were also designed to make sure that the mentality of Romans were such that they would support his charismatic rule. And we have Augustus Caesar, Augustus entering into what we can call the first propaganda campaign in history, and propaganda and image making up there. What he did was, he put his name or his image on Roman coinage. And that is a big deal. Putting your name on coinage, it's is associating then you with wealth. That was not traditional. There'd be commemorative coins of major generals and victories that they maybe celebrated, but in terms of normal Roman money, the consuls were never there. They didn't picture the faces of consuls on coins. But with Augustus, they began doing so. He also established a particular statue of himself, of this young, victorious general that he proclaimed had to be in every town and city of the empire. And it could only be produced by his own approved workshops, imperial workshops. So every statue would be the same. It's the prima porta, and it's like wonderful Augustus and his vigor and youth and strength. And that gives this image of him throughout the empire, together with the coins. And then he too, but because he was a general, and if you're a general, you can make a lot of money. He spent a lot of his own money buying bread for people, as being a patron of people, the common people. And then also he wrote. He was not stupid. He was very well educated, and he wrote several different types of things. And one of the things he wrote was, how great I am, the wonderful deeds of Caesar Augustus. So that was out there. So all these things we can talk about propaganda. Propaganda just means that which is to be propagated, sent throughout a given area and territory. And in some ways, it's the theory of propaganda hasn't ever changed. Joseph Goebbels in World War II, Hitler's right-hand man, and he was in charge of propaganda. And a very simple theory. He said, how do you effectively change public opinion? You come up with a slogan, a message. You make it simple, so you make it memorable, and you repeat it over and 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 over again until it seeps in and people start accepting it as reality. That was the basis of the Nazi propaganda campaign. That was the basis of Augustus's propaganda campaign. And then he did something else. He commissioned a poet to write a new history of Rome, or a history of Rome. History, as I talked about last week, is our identity. There was not a standard account of Roman history. Augustus wanted that. And this poet named Virgil, who became the greatest author of Roman poetry ever to have lived, he's amazing. Cicero was the greatest author of Roman prose ever to have lived. Virgil was the greatest author of Roman poetry to ever have lived. Those are just generally accepted recognitions. But Virgil wasn't all that recognized at this time. He had written a series of poems called the Eclogues, and in the fourth Eclogue, as it's called, pastoral poem, it prophesies the coming of a baby, the birth of a baby who would be a savior to the world, and an issue in a golden age. I mean, it's a nice story. And these are called the Pastoralia, they're often called too. Kind of going back to traditional old-time Roman values and virtues. And Caesar Augustus knew it and thought this is great, and also said, this prophecy refers to me. I'm the one who's going to lead Rome into a new golden age, which I'm doing already. And so, Virgil, I want you to write a history of Rome. Now, the basis of history, of Roman history, was based on Homer, the Greeks. His great works, the Iliad and the Odyssey. I'm not going to go into the whole issue of Homer and Homeric epic and all that issue. But Homer was the basis of classical education for the Greeks and for the Romans. The ideals, the values, the virtues. He said, make this Roman. Or Virgil said, I'm going to make this Roman. Whereas, I'm sorry, Homer. All of a sudden, I just couldn't remember whom I was just talking about. Homer wrote down long-standing oral traditions. Virgil creates a new story. He takes a rather minor figure in the Iliad by the name of Aeneas and makes Aeneas the central character and calls his work the Aeneid for Aeneas. And here we really see the rewriting of Roman history, which then brings about a new understanding and identity of Rome as a divinely prophesied, sanctioned, established, eternal empire. Now, I just want to show a little bit before I get into Virgil directly. Here we have the empire of the age of Augustus. Previous map I showed you was the death of Julius Caesar. Here we have it Augustus, kind of almost at its height. Where we have the, still the pink, kind of still the Julius Caesar ones, but then we have the addition of the purple and the green, which are associated territory. So all of a sudden, in terms of hegemonic control, Rome is controlling all of that territory, either directly or by clientage. Now, it's an extensive empire. But if we look at it in a world perspective, here's the next map there. We see the Eastern Han Empire is as extensive as was the Roman Empire. And they didn't really necessarily know each other. They maybe had some inkling of what was going on. I'll talk more about this in my world history course. But I just want to put this in a world perspective, because when we see it from Rome's perspective, Rome is the most glorious, extensive empire that had ever been. That wasn't the view of the Han Empire in what is today China, or even the Persian Empire. There we see. So that's just to give a little bit of world perspective, which is not to undermine Rome. And one of the things that Rome did have that the others didn't, at least to the same extent, was this self understanding as this divinely sanctioned eternal empire. Now, there's issues in China in terms of what's called the mandate of heaven. That's another issue for world history. So there's this almost sense of empire goes together with doing God's will, or the will of the gods. And that Virgil rewrote Homer for the Latins, for the Romans. Now, would love to spend the whole time talking about Virgil. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about Virgil. It's an amazing work, Already in book 1, there is the prophecy of Jupiter, or Zeus, to his daughter Venus, or Aphrodite, that her son will fulfill a prophecy, that because she's complaining. It's like, Dad, what's going on? It doesn't seem like he's going to, that you're going to carry through on what you promised me would be my son's heritage, because Aeneas was the offspring of Aphrodite and Anchises, his father, human father, so he was a demigod and a divine mother. And Jupiter says, "Don't worry, my dear, my will has not changed. Your son will go to Italy. He will found this great empire, whose borders will only be bounded by the skies and the oceans." Now, also in book 6, where Aeneas, to get back as Odysseus in the Odyssey, or the Roman form Ulysses, has to go to the underworld. And he goes to the underworld. He sees his dead father, whom, had died on his journeys, because his father, Aeneas, had carried him out of burning Troy. This all goes back to the Trojan War. The Trojan War. And Aeneas, who's a Trojan, carried his father out of burning Troy, together with the Trojan gods, and his destiny was to found this new city. It was his offspring eventually would become Romulus and Remus. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details of the great story that Virgil tells in the Aeneid about how it all gets there, except when he goes to the underworld, he sees his father, and his father and the Sibyl, who was like his guide to the underworld, is traveling through the underworld, and they see different shades, and he sees shades or souls. Some have not yet been born. He sees then the soul of Caesar Augustus. And he says, listen to me, my Romans. Put your anger behind you. Your destiny is to defend the poor and promote peace. Put away wrath. Lock it up. Be peace and good government to protect the weak. That's what you are to do. And then the Sibyl led them out from the underworld, Aeneas. And there are 2 gates from which you can exit the underworld. One is the gate of ivory, the other is the gate of pearl. And the gate of ivory is the gate of false dreams. And the Sibyl led Aeneas out of the gate of ivory, the gate of false dreams. Now, this is a debated passage, but as I read it, the Aeneid, as Virgil wrote it, was a warning to Augustus. He read the earlier parts, or had the earlier parts read to him. He thought it was great. Virgil, when we got to the end of it, thought, I'm not done with this. It should all be destroyed. And Augustus said, no, it cannot be destroyed. This is now our official version of Rome. He didn't make it to book 6. But book 6 leads with Aeneas coming out of the underworld by means of the Gate of False Dreams. And then in book 7, Virgil begins saying, now my task is more difficult. I have to tell of great wars. And how then he actually Aeneas got to Italy, or to the Italian peninsula, how he fights for the queen of the Latins, Lavinia, and has helps from the Etruscans, all together. Is my task, help me muse, because my task has become more difficult. After book 6, Pius Aeneas, who is the epitome of Roman values and piety and religion and citizenship, he's still referred to as Pius Aeneas, but more often from book 7 on, he's referred to as Saevus Aeneas, wrathful, vengeful Aeneas, and that is how the book ends. At the end of book 12 or 13, I forget which it is, it's a one-on-one battle for the queen of the Latins, Lavinia, between Turnus and Aeneas. They said, we've been fighting. Why don't we just do a mano a mano, face to face, and whoever wins gets it all. They said, okay. And Turnus first starts to throw his javelin, and Aeneas brushes it off, and then Aeneas throws his javelin and strikes Turnus in his thigh. I won't go into all the details here, but then Turnus is begging for mercy. Not that he's claiming anything. He says, at least bring my body back to my father so he can have a proper burial. And Aeneas is thinking about it, and then he gets wrathful. He says, no, how dare you ask me something like this? And he slams his sword through his throat, sending his soul to the shades below. And that's how the Indian ends, with wrathful, vengeful Aeneas. But the point here is not to interpret Virgil. That's because it is Virgil created this divine prophecy of Julius Caesar and then Octavian, Augustus Caesar, of Rome as this divinely established, divinely sanctioned, divinely almost created empire to rule the world without end forever. And Augustus loved it. He didn't, as I said, he didn't get past book 4. Is trying to shape Roman identity and self-understanding. And Augustus had already portrayed himself as a son of a god and already portrayed Julius Caesar as divinized. And it was during the reign of Caesar Augustus that another baby was born who was hailed as a savior. But that then brings me to the rise of Christianity. The rise of Christianity. I think I'm going to stop here. Have a little break. Again, my apologies. I'll come back for part 3, and maybe I will have to end up doing part 4, and I'm sorry for all of this. I know it's kind of a problem. But as I said, let's see, in a normal course, it's 2.5 hours, an hour and 15 minutes twice a week of lecture. That's 2.5 hours of lecture a week. I may exceed that this week, but it will catch up. I'm sure I'll be going more than an hour and 15 minutes in this lecture, but over all the time, I think it will work out okay. So my apologies for that. Again, we're going to stop here. I'll be back very shortly to continue where I left off. Thanks so much. See you again soon.